Hey, so Brian Mulroney died. And to hear what some politicians said about the guy, you'd think he was a saint. I get that people don't like speaking ill of the recently departed, but there is a responsibility I think that politicians have to be a little bit honest. So, because many of you asked for this, here is my take on Brian Mulroney. Now, I was born the year he was elected. I am a baby and a child of the Mulroney era. I don't know him as a politician, as an adult. I know his sound being a baby listening to the news. And that's kind of my personal interaction with the guy. I never met him. I don't think I've ever been in the same room as him. I live in a city that he lived in for a period of time. That's pretty much the extent of my personal interactions with Brian Mulroney. And so the guy dies and he is lionized. Jagmeet Singh said that he was the one who ended acid rain and ended apartheid. Obviously, conservatives were giving accolades to this magnificent statesman. And of course, Brian Mulroney was a very impressive statesman. So let's go through this. He was elected in a historic victory. His victory blew all other victories away in the past, and he really represented this new world of politics that had been around in the United States under Ronald Reagan for a couple of years by the time that Mulroney got elected. He sweeps out the Trudeau Liberals. Now, Trudeau had resigned. He was out of politics. And had it not been for the snap election called after the blundering of Joe Clark's government over breaking promises that he promised not to break, Trudeau went from resigning and being out of politics to, scratch that, I'm back in. And he runs and he wins in 1980. Now, when he wins in 1980, he wins with almost no support west of Ontario. And actually, I say almost no because I totally forget if it was like 1 or 0. But for all intents and purposes, Pierre Trudeau does not have support in Western Canada. And he's a politician from another time. Trudeau's been around at this point for decades. There is 30 years that separates the ages of these two men. And when Mulroney gets elected in 1984, Trudeau had been operating in opposition to the logic of the neoliberal project of Ronald Reagan in the United States, right? And so all of a sudden, Mulroney gets elected. These two Irish descendants are now leading both countries, and things like the Shamrock Summit become like the focal point of Canada-U.S. relations. And what's the Shamrock Summit? This is where the two men meet. The first one happens in 1985 in Quebec City, just over there. Actually, yeah, the way that you're looking at it is it's a bit backwards, but it's just over there. And they have this famous moment at Le Grand Théâtre, which is just there, where a huge chorus sings where Irish eyes are smiling, and the two men come in on stage with their wives, and they finish out the song. And Brian Mulroney actually solos the last part terribly, by the way. He can't sing. Why do I know all of this if I was like a couple of months old when this happened? It's because my next book is actually a lot about this. I spent a lot of time with Brian Mulroney in the last year. And honestly, for me, I'm really close to the decisions that he made because of how I have been writing about it in the last year. That book is coming out in a couple of months. I wish it was already out because I'd be able to say, look, it's right here. But anyway, so these two men, Mulroney and Reagan had a head start on his reforms in the United States, but he has an ideological partner in Brian Mulroney. And so what does Mulroney do? He changes fundamentally who is listened to in Ottawa and how politics are done. Key to this transformation is a group called the Business Council on National Issues, the BCNI. It turns into the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. Now they don't really need the same kind of lobby because everything is run by the corporations anyway. But back then, the BCNI becomes this extremely powerful tool that Mulroney has to make the justification for getting Canada primed for EI. For NAFTA, for free trade. We'll talk about EI in a second. And so for free trade, we've got this situation in the United States where free trade is the favored political instrument that Ronald Reagan is interested in, that Brian Mulroney is interested in. And in the mid-1980s, it wasn't just free trade, because Canada's always had a ton of trade. And actually, if you look at how much trade Canada's had pre-free trade and post-free trade, with the exception of about a decade ago, trade has actually stayed at the same level, going all the way back to like the 1930s. It's actually kind of amazing. Like we over rely on trade. That's why we don't produce very much in this country, which is why we were so vulnerable to free trade, devastating our manufacturing industries. Brian Mulroney did that. And so what had to happen to get free trade on the agenda in Canada? You had to have the work of the Business Council of National Issues, but then you also had to have fundamental changes in Canada to make that happen. So the first very interesting change was that free trade, for the first time ever, was going to include services. And this was something that the business community in the United States really, really, really wanted, because up until then, you could not have services as part of a trade agreement. So you couldn't have healthcare, you couldn't have insurance, you couldn't have business services as part of free trade. And so the United States pilots its first free trade agreements that includes services. And they pilot it with two countries. Obviously, Canada is one of them, because obviously. And you probably can guess who the second country was as well, the other little brother of the United States, Israel. And so with these piloted free trade agreements in the 1980s, services get into the business market. And fast forward to where we are today, of course, services are involved in this stuff. I mean, my God, like the Canadian government is outsourcing a lot of its literal work to these international service firms to teach them how to do things like govern, like McKinsey, for example. So this is one of the biggest changes that happens in the 1980s. But there were a lot of problems with how Canada operated that made it less attractive for the business world in the United States. And so what were the other changes that Brian Mulroney ushered in? Well, he defunded EI. By defunding EI, it went from a program that was funded by workers, businesses, and the government to being only funded by workers and businesses. This is now, it wasn't EI back then, it was called UI, unemployment insurance, which makes a heck of a lot more sense than employment insurance. And Canada becomes the only nation in the world, aside from the United States, to defund its EI system. Okay, what else does the guy do? Well, he also privatizes the Crown corporations, 23 of them, from Air Canada all the way to Connaught Biosciences in Winnipeg, our own, public biotech company. And privatizing Crown corporations is something that Mulroney started, and then the next government of Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien just go to the races and start privatizing almost the rest of the major Crown corporations in this country. So we have the privatization of Crown corporations, we have defunding EI, we have paving the way for free trade. But free trade couldn't just happen because there was a lot of things in Canada that were considered to be barriers to free trade. And the key thing, and this is argued by Maud Barlow and Bruce Campbell from the CCPA back in 1992. Again, books that I'm reading really, really closely. They had to get Canada's loonie, our dollar, to be higher than it was, because as a too low amount of dollar against the American dollar, that was a trade barrier. If a company could invest in Canada and got 71 cents on an American dollar, it was cheaper to work in Canada then. And so all of a sudden, it had to be the case that the Canadian government must increase the cost of our dollar in relation to the American dollar. And how does the government do this? Through interest rates and fucking with interest rates. And so this is the other major thing that Mulroney brings in, is he basically allows for interest rates to be the way that the economy is managed. And that is monetary policy. It gives the Bank of Canada, which is an unelected group of bankers the power to fuck with interest rates. And we all can see today what exactly that does when our interest rates are shot up or shot down as a result of decisions like this. Mulroney also got the federal government out of social housing. Rather than having social housing, the idea was to push people into getting cheaper mortgages, getting people to save through RRSPs. And that would ensure that everyone had cheap home ownership. That works well until what happens? Until we have a ridiculously overinflated housing market where you become a millionaire because your $80,000 home from 1985 is now worth, $1.5 million just because of the nature of where it was located. So we can thank Mulroney for setting that in motion as well. And I haven't even mentioned, of course, calling in the military to fight Mohawk people, Mohawk warriors at Oka, at Ganasatake, which is, of course, one of his major legacies. So, I get that people need to be kind to someone who's dead. Most people in this country who have a job have that job because they're cowards and they can't say this kind of thing in a really sober and, detached way. Brian Mulroney was a master politician. There is no question about that. He and in Canada, which is so impressive, is being a master politician in both languages, right? He came from a working class community in Baie-Comeau and rises to the top of the party, of the Conservative Party. In fact, when he won in 1984, he'd never even run for, certainly not for prime minister. He comes out of quote unquote nowhere, right? So there's no question he was a master statesman. He was a master politician. And when he first got into power in 1984, his big priority was what everybody back then called reconciliation, which was reconciling Canada East and Canada West, or the Western provinces, or stopping Western alienation. Now, Mulroney also then sells out the Red Tory tradition. And so what happens to the Conservative Party in the aftermath of Mulroney is the PC's collapse, the rise of the far right through the Reform Party. And that's, of course, leads us to where we are today. I haven't even mentioned the GST, which was, of course, where they took a manufacturer's tax, they combined it with services, they reduced the amount that it was, they applied it across the economy, and now we've got this regressive sales tax. Great, awesome. GST, nice, another great one. So, I personally would be like, fuck that guy. Honestly, good riddance to him. We must be able to have sober conversations about the impact of the lives that people have led. Because if we are going to accept that Brian Mulroney's legacy is stopping apartheid South Africa and stopping acid rain, which is like totally fucking fiction. There are elements of what he did in those things that make it not complete fiction. But if that is the legacy and we don't actually put together the current realities around the housing crisis, the affordability crisis, the fact that interest rates are driving people into the ground, the fact that we are still far too integrated with the American markets, which is a bad thing as the American empire starts to, This is the legacy of Brian Mulroney, and it was the end of Red Toryism in Canada. And I think that's a good place to end. The end of Red Toryism in Canada is the end of a century of a kind of conservative rule that appealed to doing things moderately, modestly, and to some level of tradition. There's a lot of bad that comes out of that kind of mentality, obviously, but there's also a lot of good, and it served Canada very, very well. College systems were created under this. Most of the public healthcare system was created by progressive conservative governments in different parts of this country. And that idea of progressive conservatism, today seems like a complete nonsense idea that doesn't make any sense. But that was the Conservative Party until Brian Mulroney got his hands on it and completely transformed it and brought it to a place where Red Toryism was incompatible with the way that conservatism could continue in this country. And so, the distance between a politician like Stephen Harper and Brian Mulroney, or, my God, Pierre Poilievre and Brian Mulroney, is enormous. There's a chasm there. And a lot of people, like the Andrew Coynes of the world, would lament, of course, the loss of these kinds of wonderful, great statesmen who, talked and sound like they're intelligent, right? My God, imagine what that sounds like. But we cannot sanitize his legacy either, because if we sanitize his legacy, then we completely ignore and forget how we got where we are today. And it is thanks to someone like Brian Mulroney.